Hello for almost the final time. All right, so we are covering the alleged causes of the Civil War today. All right, I made a note just before this class, reminding myself to put up test 3, and so I apologize for that not being up yet, and I'm going to do that as soon as I'm done with this video. And not only am I going to put it into Canvas to be able to take, which of course I don't expect you to take yet, but I'm going to put up a file version of it for you to look at, to be able to take a look and see what's coming in the future in the form of that final test. And it's no different from the other tests. It's virtually just test 3. It's not weighted in any manner more heavily than the other tests. All right, so yeah, no problem, Valeria. I appreciate your patience and your gratitude for that. So I hope you guys are doing okay on the other assignments so far. Just remember with some of them that because I'm terribly behind in correcting, but with your response, I didn't mean to be misleading in that I definitely want you to feel encouraged that it doesn't have to be long, your response, your written response on these. And I stand by that. Nevertheless, not only state specifically what the thesis was, right, on your given section, your argumentative section, but please also give an example, at least one, all right, of supporting data, of supporting logic used by the writer to defend that thesis. All right. Ravinder, please.
Yes, Professor. So I had a quick question. So I saw that you put in grades in Canvas. So I wanted to know the scores that we got on the assignments, does that include the extra credit or is it without the extra credit?
It should include the extra credit. If you believe that you have been shortchanged in that regard, because I've been giving out 55s, 53s, 54s, right, with 5 extra credit points to your raw score. If you are concerned on any given one that you have not received such, please Canvas message me, okay? But to be honest, I have some of you who are very faithful, and I have, a mark after mark on the roll sheet. I had 1 or 2 for which, for whatever reason, 1 or 2 assignments for which I have no written mark. I don't know what I had failed to do, what went awry, but so hence not a single person is going to get 5 extra credit points for every single one. But that should only happen, I think, just once or twice on my list. There was just 1 or 2 assignments whereby I failed to notice have any extra credit assigned. But like I said, if you've been here faithfully and you believe that you should receive all of them but that one, or it might be 2 assignments, Canvas message me. All right. But I'm according to what I have in front of me and what I write down from week to week, I am trying to adhere to that and trying to dole those extra points out fairly.
Oh, okay. Thank you for clarifying.
No problem. So like I said, of course I'm fallible. And so I could have made a mistake on a given assignment. And so just Canvas message me. I'll be happy to address that. And I think you'll find with me also is if I'm not certain about something, I always give my students the benefit of the doubt. Okay, so by all means, don't be shy in messaging me. All right. So on this one, the one that we're up to. So according to my calendar, I have this due for our summer 22 session. I have it due Wednesday night, the 10th, which is, just tomorrow. So we're not too far ahead. All right. And so with this one, this is just classic court versus revisionist history, right? remember, court history, it adheres to the notion of American exceptionalism, that we are a special, exceptional country, that what we stand for is something to be proud of, right? So like you see of things like themes like equality of opportunity, right? Equality of economic opportunity. We saw that with the thesis on the West, right? With Frederick Jackson Turner and his famous thesis about the frontier and about American meritocracy. You see that about alleged American idealism when we went earlier in the semester with the New England colonies and with Pennsylvania in particular with the Quakers, and spoke about, you know, the role of idealism of trying to make the world and people better, for lack of a better way of articulating it. And so you see that as well. And so that all plays into court history of the American Civil War. And I think a lot of us received this, despite, you know, even my generational difference with you students, perhaps we equally did as children, right? And that is that I think you could kind of foresee this one, that as an exceptional country, we can't make amends for the fact that we instituted and sanctioned slavery, right? There's nothing but apologies for that, okay, as a national legacy. Nevertheless, right, with the Civil War, it is portrayed as a crusade to finally end that injustice, to finally end that hypocrisy, okay? So how in the world was the Civil War a crusade? All right. Well, for one, right, I'll start kind of like with the broader basics. All right. The two political parties at that time were the parties that we have now. Okay. In the early 1850s, the Republican Party was established. All right. Just prior to the Civil War of 1861, less than a decade before. It, in its initial platform, stated that it was against the spread of slavery. So note, I said the spread of slavery, right? So hence nothing about what to do with slavery where it already had been sanctioned by the federal constitution and by the state constitutions where it existed, particularly right in the South, with the exception of some Western states that were beginning to spread and try to incorporate slavery, like Kansas, and with the exception of one northern state, which was Delaware. So you have this Republican Party that says no more. Slavery will not spread. It should not spread. And according to whatever resources we can pull, we're not going to allow it to spread anywhere further to the West. And its spokesman in that way, as a moderate of his day, was Abraham Lincoln, right? And contending that, not taking a stand against slavery per se, where it was, where it already existed, but saying no more, all right? And so hence the establishment of new states gobbled up in the Mexican-American War, purchased back in the Louisiana Purchase, right, of the territory. All that land was now becoming opened according to the Northwest ordinances. It was becoming incorporated into the Union slowly as unincorporated to incorporated territories, then to statehood status. Okay. And the Republican Party and moderates like Lincoln said no more. Everywhere else now, where new states are forming in the West, slavery can and should not be an option. All right. So you have that component. You had the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party was very libertarian at that time. And they stated that slavery is a state issue, period. That when you look in the Constitution, it was federally protected in that Constitution, right, by a couple of infamous clauses. And that also it's not found under Article 1, Section 8, given to Congress as broad powers. It's not given under Article 2 to the president. and his executive department. And so hence the 10th Amendment says whatever is not explicitly given, right, in the Constitution as a power to the federal authorities is rendered to the states. And so the Democratic Party was libertarian in stating that the states like Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, etc., they have the right to decide on the slavery issue themselves, right? So then you have that. And then that's on a kind of a broader note, right? And the opening to the West, by the way, I think anybody, according to anyone's narrative, opened up this can of worms, right? It definitely opened up the can of worms of slavery. What to do about it in the future? What do we decide upon it? Who has sovereignty over it, et cetera, okay? And so then you had the diehards, right, on both sides, who were, pushing the envelope, so to speak. So on the Southern side, you had those who were adamant, right, that Southern representation stay at least equal to Northern or free soil representation. Because remember, in each new state that's opening up in the West, you get 2 senators no matter what, and you get 1 House rep for every 50,000 civilians or citizens, right, in the lower house of Congress. And so they wanted to make sure that each new state was opening up and applying for statehood status from territory to state, right? First Missouri, and then Kentucky and Kansas before that, Missouri, then Kentucky and Tennessee, and then after that Kansas got a lot of attention in the 1850s, and Nebraska, etc. So at any rate, you have the diehards who are saying that are saying we're watching everything like the Missouri Compromise of the 1820s, right? Whereby they said that the line above Missouri, there could be no slavery to the west above that line, but slavery can be allowed in Missouri, and then we'll open up Maine in the East Coast and allow it to be a free state. And so there was a sense of fairness to it, right? Of balancing quid pro quo. You scratch my back and then I'll scratch yours for both sides. But to the Southern extremists, right, like the fire eaters, their demands were more harsh, and that if they didn't get what they wanted, they threatened violence in the West, and they threatened secession, leaving the country, right, formally disuniting their state from the United States Federal Republic. And so you see that with Bleeding Kansas in the 1850s. There was a voice in the middle known as Stephen Douglas, and he proposed as a candidate to the Senate that they decide by a referendum, a popular vote in Kansas, what to do with slavery. And both sides cheated. Both sides contended that it won and that the other side had cheated. Neither side agreed to step down, and it devolved into a mini civil war in Kansas itself, right? And so, like I said, the fire eaters, or later known as the bushwhackers, resorted to violence to try to intimidate people at the polls, threatened to leave the Union, etc., right? And so you had that, and then of course non-cooperation with lobbyist groups from the North, especially on economic issues, to try to hurt them, right? Mainly like textile manufacturing and metallurgical works, which were beginning in the North. These Southern fire eaters would say no to anything that lined the pocket of these Yankee manufacturers in the North, just spitefully, to try to bring them to their knees and force them to compromise concerning the West and allowing slavery to spread therein. All right. And then the North had its own counterparts to that, right? You have these Republicans that became known as radicals, radical Republicans that you could read about in #1. And they likewise, they were a bit vindictive in Congress. They would say, anything that helped Southern cotton, for instance, they would vote against, right? And to try again, like the other side, to bring the Southern planter class to its knees and force it to capitulate, or at least, compromise when it came to the West. And so you also had some like Salmon Chase and others who wrote out tracts and gave speeches for the common Southern people, almost to rile up a sense of class warfare in the South from these Yankee Northern Republican, congressmen who hadn't even oftentimes been to the South. And they would encourage the Southern white people saying, hey, those jobs that they're giving to the quote Negro slaves should be given to you. You guys are poor and worse off economically than the slaves themselves. Slavery is hurting you as poor white folk just as badly as it's hurting the slaves. Well, perhaps not as badly. They couldn't say that, but they would say that it was very badly affecting, right, negatively affecting the poor white demographic of the South, depriving them of jobs and opportunities and advancement opportunities through sharecropping, etc. And so, of course, to the South, right, they were saying that people like Salmon Chase and these other Republicans from the North were trying to stir up class warfare. And then, of course, you also had the abolitionists, right? And the abolitionists, they were not willing to compromise concerning the political facet or side to things, right? Because you have a contract clause in the Constitution that says all contracts that have been made, prior to this constitutional convention are equally valid after this convention as they were before. All property owned before this convention is equally owned after, right? And so, and then you have, mentions of persons under bondage and 3/5 of all persons when it comes to taxation and other instances of the federal government implicitly mentioning and sanctioning and giving okay to slavery, right? And you won't, when you look at Article 1 and Article 2, you won't find anywhere in the Constitution whereby the power is given to the federal government to end slavery. You'll find an end to the slave trade and to end the immigration of slaves brought in from Africa, the Caribbean, etc. Absolutely, you'll find that, but not ending slavery itself as an institution, right? Where it had already been sanctioned by state government conventions, and those state government constitutions had then been okayed by the federal Constitution, by federal Congress to be accepted, along with slavery in it. And so you had some issues there that even our beloved Abraham Lincoln felt like he couldn't get around, whereby he contended that he had no personal power, no constitutional permission, and even no personal desire to interfere in slavery where it already existed in Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia, etc. And yeah, but today that sounds terrible, coming from such a beloved patriarchal leader like Abraham Lincoln. But the abolitionists, right? They saw Abraham Lincoln and the moderate Republicans as lukewarm cowards, basically. And so they said, no, heck no, we don't care. So William Lloyd Garrison, as an abolitionist, right? He burnt a copy of the Constitution in front of a crowd, and they tried to lynch him, and the police saved his life. But they were very, very gutsy on this one, as they said, basically, the heck with the Constitution. We'll throw it aside. And we unilaterally declare that because it is a natural right not just a civic right and law given right, that will end it, that Congress should and ought to have the power to end slavery everywhere in all states, no matter what has already been okayed and sanctioned in the past. And so that was one thing. And then some of the abolitionists went a step further and said, well, not only should we abolish slavery, but we should give certain basic rights to the quote Negroes, right? Because as you know, right, there's a social, political, and economic realm to reality. And so you could do things politically by law, but socially, how people interact, how they're going to treat African Americans, how they're going to allow their kids to play with them or go to school with them, or their children to marry them. That's a whole other can of worms, right? In the social realm, much beyond the political realm. And so some of the abolitionists went that much further. Some of them went a step further and said, I think we should free all the slaves, Congress, that is, right? And everywhere. And I think that we should give them certain basic economic rights, right? And to that right, it's that to be remunerated for their work. So unlike the past as slaves, when they work now in the future, they deserve wages like anybody else, and to be able to collect those wages, their right to life, liberty, and property, right? Which the founding fathers had espoused long before this. And so then some went a step further than that and said, well, I think they should go another level of citizenship wise with their rights, and they should be able to be allowed to politically participate, some of the abolitionists thought. And that is to vote, to run for office. And this was just unheard of, you guys, even in the North, because unfortunately the Sambo image, remember the SAMBO image, the happy-go-lucky, animal-like, just ignorant African-American man in particular. And so that Sambo image was hard to break psychologically, socially, culturally. And so, but some of the abolitionists went that step further. And then ultimately, some even went the furthest step, you might argue, and even stated that Black and white Americans ought to integrate completely, that they ought to be able to go to the same institutions, the same public facilities, to be able to intermarry, have children together, etc. And of course, that was just so unheard of that it constituted a very radical minority view of the 1840s and 50s, of the antebellum before the Civil War era. But some of the abolitionists were there, right? So what the heck, how did they just suddenly get there in this generation, right? And you know, and according to some history books, they don't delve too far into that sometimes. You might think of like your high school classes, perhaps. You have the class of this year, then the class of that year. And you'll notice sometimes that there's kind of a collective identity of all the sophomores when you were a junior, and that there was another type of identity of all the seniors, et cetera, that maybe a lot of them were jocks, or maybe a lot of them were very intelligent and went to big schools, or a lot of them were very rebellious, et cetera, right? And so some people just make that general assumption that this was just an out of the ordinary, just an anomalous generation, this antebellum, this before the Civil War generation that stirred all this trouble up, right? And then other people try to find more rational, historical rationale for it, as to, you know, to decide why they think this generation became so different. And so, you know, some, from what I've come across, just basic things like the, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And some of you probably are more familiar with that in psychology than I am. I just barely dabbled in psychology. But from what I think I recall of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, is, you know, you're not going to be thinking about ontological things like, why am I here on earth? What's my reason for existence? You're not going to get into deep philosophical musings, religious awakenings, etc. If you're worried about what to eat from day to day, if you're worried about being eaten by some Paleolithic mega animal, right, like a saber-toothed cat or something. And so hence in more primitive times, man can't afford, he doesn't have the time to think on more, philosophical and ontological things as far as why we're here and trying to improve humanity and the world, etc. And the argument, how that argument goes is that in this generation, things were much more comfortable for arguably the first time in American history. So, we looked at already Alexis de Tocqueville and his musings about how there was such equality of condition amongst Americans, and revisionists tear into that. But yet, compared to other countries, there might be still some truth to that. So that a lot of Americans were no longer worried about where their next meal was going to be, but now they're developing lots of cities, lots of Western movement and establishment of Western counties and territories and states. Okay. And like I said, especially population density in many of these areas moving westwardly. And so hence, right, you're going to have practical problems that you're going to have a level of comfort, first of all, whereby you're not so worried anymore about your day-to-day living circumstances and have more time to think on deeper things. But also you have a reason to address improvement in many realms of life because of urbanization itself. As you're probably familiar with, when you read historically the history of any civilization, when you read urbanization, oftentimes so many generic problems arise from urbanization alone. Infrastructure, transportation, water and sewage management, utilities, crime, etc. Right? Worried about natural disasters, fires, etc. Destruction of property, legal fighting in a court of law, etc., etc. So that's what happens here. Is in the antebellum period, a lot of cities mushroomed, and so hence they began establishing these committees, so to speak, and they trying to improve perceived problems. So they fought against poverty and homelessness, alcoholism, crime, etc. And so trying to help the change and improve the prison system, change the asylum system for those with psychological ailments. And so a myriad of reforms erupted, probably without coincidence, in this antebellum generation, right? And then you had people like the transcendentalists, philosophical hippies, I say that with tongue in cheek, who wanted every human being to be able to, kind of like the beatniks, 120 years later in the 1950s, allow people to seek out their purpose in life through experience, through travels, etc., and uninhibited freedom and autonomy for every individual to be his or her own king or queen, to travel, to taste life, to experience things, to try out different trades as far as what he or she is meant to do for a living, etc. So these transcendentalists, right, needless to say, they also were abolitionists because they thought African Americans as human beings also qualified for that right to uninhibitedly pursue their own purpose in life, right? So, and then amongst them, right, you had Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. And Henry David Thoreau argued for civil disobedience, said that there are laws written in the universe, and sometimes civic laws made by man and government get them right, and sometimes they get them wrong. And when the governments don't get them right, it is the right and the duty of civilians to oppose those civic laws that are against the natural laws, to bring attention to the injustice of those civic laws. And so hence, Henry David Thoreau stood up against the Mexican-American War, as well as slavery, catching fugitive slaves. And so they garnered attention for the cause of abolition of slavery, right? You had religious awakenings again during the antebellum period. Charles Finney and others made it very clear that that American religion, American Christianity, was no longer Calvinistic, right? Where it believed that it's just meant to be. Whoever's meant to be will go to heaven, and whoever's meant to be will go to hell. That God decides who he's going to forgive through Jesus and decides who he won't. And now this is more Arminian now, after a guy named Jacob Arminius of the Netherlands, is now it's everyone has the chance, and God wants everyone to go to heaven, and they all have the chance to choose Jesus. And so religion played a part here as well. And so you have all these reforms going on. Like I said, the women really got involved for the first time in politics in American history, arguably, particularly with the vice squad movements against prostitution, alcohol, domestic abuse, the employment of children at the workplace, etc. And they lobbied, they walked in parades, they gathered signatures, they addressed legislative bodies, they made speeches, which was unheard of until the antebellum period, right? And some were even Black women, okay, like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, okay? And so then you also had two things that brought these reformers and the abolitionists a bigger stage to cause more trouble, if you will, in a good way. One was the press. It was known as the cylindrical rotary press, the steam-powered press. Now, with the steam engine, you could mass produce and mass copy newspapers, okay, for the first time in modern history. So, the Gutenberg press was very intricate in changing each letter one at a time and so forth. And now this is the beginnings of the origins of, photocopying. And so in mass. And then in addition to that, to the printed word, is you had lyceums, Lyceums. And lyceums were intellectual fairs that spread out, especially in the New England states of the Northeast. And in them, you would go and pay a small fee and go in and listen to a variety of experts speak on a myriad of subjects. So one moment you could be listening to, an ornithologist speaking about birds and their predatory skills, etc. And then the next person comes up is an abolitionist. And so that's where another avenue through which abolitionists got a voice was through the lyceums as well. But to the people in the South and to Southerners moving to the West, right, this demographic in the North were the troublemakers that stirred it all up. And in hindsight, right, in court history, we are proud of that demographic, and we almost grin and say, absolutely, they were the troublemakers, because it was a fight that needed to be fought, right? A crusade to end slavery. And so it was a good fight to provoke. And so then in addition to the idealism and the confrontational stance of this loud minority, primarily from the North, right? You had polarizing events that were happening, especially concerning the West, that were almost making Americans at this time period choose a side instead of just stay out of it, as they did generation after generation, right? It was the elephant in the room that you just didn't mention, slavery. And now suddenly with this generation, it can't be ignored. It's the topic right in front of everyone's face. Everyone is beginning to talk about it, and everyone's feeling an almost obligation and an instinctive visceral reaction to everything to choose a side, right? For or against slavery and its future in this country. And so with those polarizing events, I mean, you have, like I mentioned already, Bleeding Kansas, when they tried to decide on slavery by popular vote, and it devolved into a bloody civil war. That clearly was, had a provocative effect on that generation, and made a lot of people feel a sense of loyalty to one side or another, right? The issue of the Underground Railroad, the famous 6 Northern senators who were supposedly funding it all and getting these people across the Canadian border. Harriet Tubman speaking to Congress and boasting about it, this Black woman, runaway slave. And so it was too much for some of the Southerners to handle. The fugitive slave law that had been established, and people in Syracuse, New York, at a Black church and other places like that, refusing to give up a Black person inside that church as a runaway to these Southerners who had come all the way to New York to recapture this supposedly runaway slave. So the fugitive slave law drama and all that elicited a lot of emotion. The Dred Scott case, right, where his master brought him up into the North from the South and then died. And he said, "Hey, my master's dead. He brought me up to Northern free soil. I'm free now." And Roger B. Taney just threw the gavel at him and said, "No, a Black person, first of all, not even just a slave, but a Black person has no issue of bringing forth a political case in a court of law anywhere. You are chattel slave, chattel property, no different from a farm implement or a cow. And so if a man brings his chattel from one state to another, it's still his chattel, no matter where he moves to." And it just infuriated a lot of people who were not only abolitionists, but those who were like on the fence. And they thought, this is just way too regressive. It's way too backwards of a decision, this Dred Scott case, right? And then John Brown, trying to foment, as a white Northern religious zealot, tried to foment a slave rebellion by handing out arms to slaves in Virginia, took over a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, killed some soldiers, took their guns and tried to give them to the slaves nearby. Instead was captured and hanged. And his trial was just, very dramatically, magnetically watched by that entire generation. So lots of dramatic events were happening also that helped bring America to this fight, this crusade, if you will. And then you also have the alleged evolution of Abraham Lincoln. And so note, according to court history, they don't state, even in court history that praises America and its leaders, they don't portray Abraham Lincoln as some abolitionist, like from the beginning. No, nowhere near, right? He was very moderate. in his stance. But when you look as the war progressed, he arguably, you could find data if you wanted to pick and choose, to suggest that he became more and more convicted, more and more courageous, more and more principled as the war progressed against slavery and taking a firmer stance in favor of the slaves. All right. So take a look at the bottom of this section for evidence to support that. How he began allegedly, pretty moderately on the political spectrum. And like I said, became more emboldened, more principled, something closer approximating an abolitionist by the time he was killed. All right. So that together is the court history of the Civil War, right? Is that this exceptional generation, right, was idealistic, especially in the North, and they forced the country, as well as events that were happening in the West, right, forced the country to pick a side and to face this topic, okay? And that Abraham Lincoln, as our leader, finally came around by the end of the Civil War to do something meaningful in helping end this awful institution that never should have been. All right. So take a look at that and read through it and tell me what you think, but also read through it even if you choose number 2, because it'll be relevant to at least 1 or 2 questions on the final. All right. Then number 2, revisionist history. The Civil War did not entail a moral crusade against slavery. So with revisionist historiography, they look at things like indifference or moderation in the North, right? Like I said, the Republican Party just said no more spreading of slavery to the West. That's it. Okay. You look at the Free Soilers in the North, and they wanted jobs in the West to be opened to poor white men instead of to black slaves. So ironically, right, you could be against slavery and be as racist as they come and say you want economic opportunities and jobs given to white men instead of African-American slaves in the West in particular, but also in the South. So you could oppose slavery for all the wrong reasons. Also, some of the rich lobbyists in Congress, they knew, right, that it was a numbers game there in Congress, that if you were a slave-owning cotton producer, right, cotton plantation owner, it didn't matter if you lived in New Mexico or Virginia, right? What's good for one is going to be good for the other. And that's known as a faction, a group that shares the same self-interest and or ideology, right? And so they didn't want the planter class in the South to gain factional allies in the West. And so if New Mexico, known for a climate and soil that would supposedly be amenable to cotton production, Southerners really pressed for New Mexico to include slavery, right? But some Northerners, lobbyist groups, wanted to ensure that New Mexico did not produce cotton so that there would not be new allies in New Mexico to vote along with the Virginia guys in Congress, because they would vote the same way on the key issues, right? Because what lines the pocket of one lines the pocket of the other. So that's known as the faction thesis, right? That they opposed slavery, or they wanted slavery just because just to do with allies, economic allies in Congress. You also have the fact of that you have to confront of how salient, how much it stood out, and how virulent, how bitter and dangerous racial discrimination was in the North throughout the Civil War. So there were what, 19 northern states? How many of them gave some African Americans some political rights? 5 of the 19. Look at how the North handled the idea of freeing and arming the slaves and allowing them to fight in the Civil War for the North. Look at the racist reactions to that decision. All right. Look at also how desperate militarily the North became just prior to freeing and arming the slaves. So yes, Howard Zinn and other revisionist historians more than suggest that they think America, the American Yankee Northern government, the Northern 19 states, right, that stayed in the Union and tried to keep the 11 Southern states in the Union by force and not leaving as they joined the Confederacy, that those Northern states forced, that they wanted the South to, where am I going with this? That the North wanted the South to be broken in half, to be weakened, to be psychologically frightened. And what better way to do that than to free their slaves and arm them and put them against them? So that's what they did. So according to number 2, it was pragmatism. It was pragmatic self-interest. It was self-preservation. Even a bit of ruthlessness that motivated the North in doing what it did for slaves. To spite, to weaken, to defeat the South. So then you have the problem with number 2, to whatever extent that this might be true, then do we have an issue? Do we have a problem that resonates to this day? That even when we finally did something about this awful institution of slavery, that perhaps did we do it with the wrong intentions, with the wrong motives? Some would say a result is a result, but I might argue the contrary to that, that motives matter. Because it attests to the social realm, right, of reality. Yeah, politically, the 13th Amendment ending slavery is wonderful. The 14th Amendment, enfranchising those born and naturalized here, wonderful. The 15th Amendment, guaranteeing that the rights and privileges of citizenship explained in 14th Amendment include suffrage, the right to vote and run for office, and not to be excluded from African Americans. Wonderful, right? But a social environment of discrimination, you still have that problem. And it carries on long after the civil rights movement 100 years later, where Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and others are fighting this crusade 100 years later, especially in the South. All right, so are there any questions? All right. All right, so are we good? Can I get any thumbs up? You guys okay? I mean, and it's it's kind of a long lecture today. Thank you. All right, thank you. John, could I get your could you please text me before we all leave? Your are you Giancarlo De Leon? Would you be willing to put up a thumb or type yes or unmute yourself for a moment? All right, well, I'm going to leave that to my discretion because I haven't heard anything from you, Jean, but I think so. I'm going to
Oh,
assume,
me?
Jean, that you're Giancarlo Garcia de Leon.
Yes.
Right on. Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
All right, guys. So thank you. You'll get your points for this. I appreciate you. We're almost done. Hang in there. Almost finished.
You.
Thank you.
Professor, I have a quick question regarding the homework that's due on Monday.
Yeah.
Do we just pick one of those questions and then when you say research it, how much facts do you want us to research? Like one or two things to support whatever we're going to write about?
So are you talking about the one after this on fighting the
Yes.
Civil War?
It's the Civil War short essay write-up that's due on the 12th.
Yes. Yeah, that one's tough. It really is because I'm trying to find a way to articulate my request to find a more balanced response from my students, because a couple have gone well beyond what I expected, and so I gave them extra credit points. But then quite a few did not go as far as I wanted. I don't expect you in this short of a semester to have a 3 to 5 page response with 2 to 5 sources that are utilized and quoted from, etc. I don't, but I do expect at least one source and at least I don't know, at least a page. I'm looking for, at least a page of data and good solid arguments for whatever it is that you're contending in answer to that question, with just at least one solid use of a source. An online source is fine.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
No problem. But I'm glad to hear you asking about that, because that will catch up on us quickly. And as we'll speak about it on Thursday, you only have one more day and night to do it. So I'm glad to hear that you're already pace-wise approaching that assignment.
Oh yeah, I thought today was Thursday, but it's Tuesday.
Oh, good for you. That's a good mistake to make. Good for you. All right. So thank you guys. You guys have a great evening and stay in there. We're just a couple assignments away from finishing.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
You as well. Thank you.